This Mode 4 behind me is widely accepted by many guitar players to be the worst amp ever made by Marshall. Ugly, overpriced, solid state, fizzy, scooped, glorified solid state, unreliable. It's overcomplicated, it has too many controls and at the same time not enough controls as it shares EQs between some of the channels. It's confusing, is it 1 amp, is it 2 amps, is it 2 channel, 4 channel? Why 2 effects loops and what even is a parallel effects loop anyway? It's got a stupid oversized foot controller that not only if you do want to use a different controller you can't because you have to use the proprietary one that comes with it, you've also got to use the impossible to buy foot switch cable. But I'm not so sure. Yeah, there are downsides to this amp. Like I said, a lot of people think this is the worst amp Marshall ever made. I think it may have been misinterpreted and misunderstood. I think it could be one of Marshall's most underrated amps. I bought this amp maybe a year or two ago and I paid an enormous, well, it worked out about £150, so under $200. And I'll be honest, I bought it because it was a cheap head that looked cool as part of my YouTube backdrop. Everyone else on YouTube has these big walls of amp heads behind them, and I just wanted to fit in. And I only had my diesel and a couple of other heads at the time because I'm all in with the diesel VH4 and it does everything for me, and I haven't felt the need for anything else since getting it. I always looked down on these amps in the early 2000s, and I remember when they came out in 2003, I instantly hated it. I hated that it seemed to be a cheap knockoff of a rectifier. You know, it felt like Marshall had just gone, oh yeah, let's just make it look like a rectifier and don't even worry about a power section. These new metal and early 2000s guitar players, they don't care about tone. They just want the sound of mid-scoop bees in a tin. And maybe they were right, but either way, it seemed like an attack and a money grab. And who did they get to promote them? John 5, System of a Down, and Dave Navarro. Could you get any more cliche for the time? I didn't really appreciate John 5 back then. He was just Marilyn Manson's guitar player to me. Now he's probably up there in my top 10 players. His Instagram clips make me sick. So can you imagine my surprise when I bought this £150 prop, plugged it in, and it sounded good? At no point did I think it sounded solid state or any of the adjectives commonly associated with that: sterile, brittle, harsh, clinical. The clean amp with all the headroom was pristine and huge sounding. Mixing in some of the digital reverb made it sound even better. The crunch side is instant JCM 800. It sounds organic and true to the original. I had a 2204 50 watt 800 for a few years, and this covers that sound, except you got an effects loop, a built-in reverb, a master control that actually works at home, plus 3 extra amp channels. The Amp 2 side goes from 900 and JMP1 preamp territory, if we're talking just Marshall, up to probably more gain than any other Marshall has had before on the 4th channel. Every channel takes boosts really well. I especially like to run my Boss SD1 into the crunch or Amp 2 OD2 to push things and tighten them up. love that they've given us the option of a series or parallel loop. The main competition at the time was the 3-channel rectifier series, and that had a much more complicated parallel loop that a lot of people didn't really get on with. I love them now and I much prefer them, but at the time there were far less effects around that had a kill dry function, which is really important if you don't want any weird phasey sounds. The tone matrix control on the second side of the amp is a very powerful tool, and it can be used to completely revoice where the mid frequencies of the amp sit. I think the Mode 4 has the potential to really excel as an amp for today's modern metal and specifically gent player. With the tone matrix and the more than enough headroom to keep the bass intact and the amount and type of gain available, I think that if you're a gent player or a progressive metal player on a budget, give it a try. Look at me talking as if people even use real amps anymore. The downsides to me are the foot switch. It's too big and clunky, and the amp really should have had MIDI capabilities. It would have made it far more usable. Other Marshalls had it before and after this amp, so there was no reason not to include it. The shared EQ is limiting. A few more knobs wouldn't hurt anyone. Look at the JVM or rectifier. The resonance, presence and solo level controls could be moved to the back to give a bit more space. I think over the years people have suggested that it's an unreliable amp. This one's nearly 20 years old and it's working fine. I also think that if you find one that's still working at this point, it'll probably last a good while longer, but this is the chance you take with all these older amps, like the hybrid amps or the digital modelling amps. Everybody knows how amazing the Mode 4 cabs are. I think it's time that more people gave the actual amp a chance, even if it is 20 years too late. Do you remember the Line 6 Veta? It came out around the same kind of time as this. I made a video for it just here. If you've enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy that one too.